We go into our extended election special live on Live this Monday, and I'm joined today by political scientist Vincent Martigny, who's also with the École Politique and Sevipov here in Paris. Thank you for being on the programme.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
And we'll also be talking to Nicolas Sarkozy's former media advisor, Frank Tapiro, and Front National MEP Bruno Gollnisch, who'll be joining us in the studio. And today we're going to pick apart really what is happening in French politics following yesterday's first round. Now, we heard there of Laurent Bouvet, who was talking from the University at Versailles. First and foremost, in your opinion, is the Socialist Party dead?
No, because the party doesn't die in 1 minute. So the party is clearly in crisis. It's been in crisis for years, probably, since François Hollande also became the president, because he had difficulties to find a very clear line of what it was to be a socialist anymore. You could see that many of the supporters, traditional supporters of the Socialist Party, have been either supporting Emmanuel Macron or Jean-Luc Mélenchon. So you have a split of votes between potentially two different sides or different conceptions of what is to be a left-winger. Part of them have been supported as centrist, centre-left candidate, which is Emmanuel Macron, but the part of the electorate of the Socialist Party have been supporting Benoît Hamon and Jean-Luc Mélenchon have supported another version of what the left is. So I would say that the party as a party system or as a party
entity,
as a machine entity is in crisis, but there's still a quite coherent electorate.
Now, there's an interesting thing that just came out today. Hollande has now publicly endorsed Emmanuel Macron in a television statement, but there were also some pundits coming from, a bit of punditry coming from across the channel in the UK, saying that Macron is a Trojan horse for the traditional Socialist Party, that François Hollande has installed Macron as his certain successor with the collusion of the media and magistrates, of course. What would your take be on that?
What I don't like about this way of formulating things is that it means that it would mean it's a plot, and it's no plot at all. I don't think that François Hollande would have liked that Macron actually would be the candidate in his place, because I think François Hollande, if he had to redo that twice, would be the candidate of the Socialist Party. That's what he would like to do, rather than having his hair or his spiritual hair to be in his place. But at the same time, one must admit that it's, let's say, a Pyrrhus victory for François Hollande, because in a way he lost by not being able to be the newly elected president next time. But at the same time, you could see that his spiritual legacy, once again, is quite embodied by what is Emmanuel Macron, at least economically speaking, and in the conception that he has of what would be a progressist left.
Now, let's just also have a look at Macron himself. I mean, I was talking there about Hollande coming out, and well, I suppose he had to choose between a rock and a hard place. He had to endorse Macron. There was also various other socialist stalwarts who have rushed to endorse Macron, of course, in the hopes of being rewarded potentially with ministerial appointments and all the like. But are the claims that Macron has established a Blairite third-way political entity credible here in France?
Just to answer the first part of your question, when you say that most of the supporters of Hollande have been rushing into Macron, maybe because they want to get reward, I don't think it's really the reason why they did that. Once again, as Max Weber, the political scientist from Germany says,
have they any choice?
But they say politics is always a mix of strategy and conviction. You can't underestimate the fact that people surrounding François Hollande are clearly against the National Front. They don't want the National Front to win the election. So the first reason why they endorsed Emmanuel Macron is that they thought that he would be a better candidate than Marine Le Pen. That's the first reason. And Macron was very clear by the fact that he wouldn't endorse anybody to a ministerial job because he would have been supported, especially between the two rounds, because otherwise everybody would be a minister. So I don't think that's the idea, really.
It's not the idea. Well, look, I mean, I want to go to Frank Tapiro, who is a former media advisor to former French President Nicolas Sarkozy. Frank, thank you for taking our call. It's unfortunate that you weren't able to join us today. It would have been good to get, but you're very busy. But let's look at what's happening with Les Républicains now. I mean, basically, François Fillon has accepted that he has dragged the party down with him. And Alain Juppé has said that, well, now we have to redraw the Républicains' political line. What do they need to do?
You know, it's very difficult because François Fillon was alone in this campaign. And even if all the Republicans said, okay, we are behind him, sometime they wanted to quit. You remember a few weeks ago, they wanted him to quit. So today, you know, all said yesterday it was not a defeat of the right party, it was not the defeat of the Republican, but the François Fillon defeat. So now they are focusing on François Fillon to say, we have not lost again. And in politics, it's very weird, it's very funny. You never lose. When you just talk about François Hollande, about Emmanuel Macron, it's the way François Hollande has chosen, to be there and to say, haha, you thought I have totally messed out my presidency during 5 years, but today, if you have Macron, it's because of me. And it's exactly the same game, unfortunately, for the right party, because instead of saying that, they would have think of the new vision of the right party, the new vision of the Republican. And since 2 or 3 years, I really don't understand what is really the strategy, what is the project of France they have in their mind. So today, unfortunately, we will have against an ego war. And France and politics, it's always an ego war. You have Star Wars and you have an ego war today. So it will be at the end of the day, who will be Luke Skywalker or Darth Vader? And in the left, we know because today Luke Skywalker is, of course, Emmanuel Macron. Darth Vader is, of course, Marine Le Pen. But on the right party, you have no one today. Because you have only egos and you don't have ideas.
But Frank, if you were the media advisor to the next leader of Les Républicains, well, first and foremost, who would you put your money behind to actually take over Les Républicains? And what would be the first word of advice you'd give him? Or her?
Or her, yeah. I think that you're right to say her because the first name I have in my mind is Nathalie Kosciusko-Morizet, because she's not only because she's a woman, but because she's, for me, the one that mix the best of the Republican and the new way of thinking politics. And I think really that all the other one, Barouin, and they have talent. Really, they have talent, but they don't have the vision because they have ego. And I'm really sure that only a woman can get out of this ego war and propose something. Think about the French people. Think about what is really the vision for the Republican. Otherwise, in 1 or 2 years, you will see, and we will have a talk later, they won't have any progress in the way of thinking politics. And unfortunately for them, Emmanuel Macron showed them the way, showed them that they were wrong before. Because when he said no right, no left, it was a way to give, this information to them. They don't really, they are not focused on that. They only focus on who is going to be the leader, who is going to have the power for the next legislative election in June.
Indeed. Now, and I mean, Frank, you are no stranger to having to deal with people with egos, so I definitely will take your point on that. But picking up from that, if you could please stay on the line with us a little longer, that would be great. Just picking up on the point of egos and picking up on the point of strategies and picking up on the point of really mobilizing, I'd like to pass a question over to Bruno Gollnisch, who has been able to join us, coming all the way over across Paris from the 10th arrondissement, traffic notwithstanding. Let's look. The polls were always saying that Marine Le Pen was going to lead the first round. Now, she didn't get the lead she wanted. She was about 2.5% below Emmanuel Macron. Now, you are an MEP with the Front National. Let's just take a look into the next 2 weeks, Bruno, if you wouldn't mind. What is Le Pen's strategy for round 2? Are we going to be seeing more of the rhetoric about immigration or security, or are we going to see her try to serenade the centrist ground that Macron has now nicely monopolized?
No, I think there are. Well, first of all, I would like to say that I've been very much interested by what Mr. Tapiro said about. As far as I understood, he does think that women have no ego, contrary to men. I find it a little bit sexist, and I never noticed that in my own party. But anyway, it's his own.
Well, France is still a very patriarchal place. At the end of the day, I mean, old habits die hard. I mean, as you know yourself, it's there's been a long list of potential candidates for the presidency who have never gotten very far.
Yes.
But back to the point.
But coming to your point, I think that there are still margins for important progress, because Well, it's absolutely sure that all the leaders, we used to say the establishment is pushing Mr. Macron, and the last one, last but not least, being Mr. Hollande, which makes things much clearer that Mr. Macron is what I would call in French. I don't know if there is an equivalent expression. My English is much too poor, but it's a bébé Hollande, a baby Hollande. Well, after all, he has been a minister for economy, and beforehand he was an advisor for economic matters. So he will have, if there is a debate, to bear some responsibility for the actual situation of the country, and he's not absolutely brand new in the field of political.
But you're talking about Macron. I'm talking about Le Pen, Madame Le Pen. What is she going to put on the table that is different in the next 2 weeks to get the electorate back on track?
I think that, but beside the attitude of the leaders, there are, for example, I do think that I know many people who supported Mr. Fillon and who were rather, conservative-minded, but who would like to at least restrain the massive immigration policy or change this trend. We are not very satisfied with the situation of actual situation of European Union and so on, who do not necessarily believe in the huge benefits of complete free trade and so on. And I'm quite sure that these people who stick also to traditional values will vote in favor of Marine Le Pen. And even among Mr. Mélenchon's supporters, I think there are many people who are very critical about European Union. And it is very significant, by the way, that Mr. Mélenchon didn't make any statement yesterday. There are people who are critical about what they call ultra-liberalism, about the domination of financial power, against also globalism. I mean, so at least some kind of globalism. Well, obviously, many differences, but I think many of them will vote in favor of Marine Le Pen.
On that way. Well, I want to pass, on what your comments there about what we can expect over the next 2 weeks. Back to Vincent Martigny from Sevipov here. You wanted to reply to something that Bruno just said.
There's a possibility that there may be more votes for Marine Le Pen than she had for the first round, but as a matter of fact, it's very, very unlikely that she wins the election. Just for pure dynamic of the campaign, it was very important for her to come first in order to have the dynamic that allows the potentiality of creating a victory in the end. So I think for me, that of course, Mr. Gollnisch supports a candidate.
Yes, but there is also dynamic on our side.
And that's normal, but at the same time, I think that the FN is now thinking seriously about what's going to happen in June with the parliamentary election.
Exactly. Well, how are they going to form? Who are they going to form a government with? I mean, only to date, I think we only have two candidates, two MPs, or should I say, Assembly, membres d'Assemblée, who would actually go on board with the Front National.
Two in the lower chamber and two in the higher chamber.
Yeah, it should happen that there will be more elected members of the National Front. But in a way, the National Front comes from such a small number of MPs that it can only increase. In a way, it can claim victory, whatever happens. But let's face it, the day after the first round, it's a disappointment for Marine Le Pen not to have reached a high level. She expected to have around 27, 28, and she knew that above 30 there was a possibility for a dynamic for the campaign. This did not happen, so now what they're trying to do is trying to think about parliamentary elections in June.
Well, this is a question I'd like to put to both you and to Bruno and yourself, Vincent, is now let's look at the events of the last 3 to 4 weeks. One could notice, I mean, myself personally living in the 19th arrondissement, a massive mobilisation of support for Jean-Luc Mélenchon, specifically with young volunteers distributing leaflets at metro stations and on the streets. Now, back to your point about getting the Mélenchon vote. Can you envisage yourself, Vincent first, I would like to put it, and then over to Bruno, and if we still have Franck on the line, I'd like to get his opinion. Yeah. Can we envisage a significant percentage of France Insoumise support moving to the Front National?
It depends what you call a significant number of supports.
Well, something that could boost the levels to a point where we would actually get no.
No, because, I mean, there was about 20% to France Insoumise. A big third of them came from a tactical vote of left-wing voters who preferred to vote for Jean-Luc Jean-Luc Mélenchon rather than Benoît Hamon because they thought that he wouldn't be able to get to the second round and they hoped that Mélenchon would be the second round. Then you have 1/3 of former communists and the communists will not vote for Marine Le Pen. And maybe you have 1/3 of what I call the angry voters. And maybe
this would be the youth voters as well, surely.
Yeah, but once again, these angry voters have this point in common with National Front supporters that they are angry against the system and among themselves, maybe a part of them will vote. But that's only 1/3 of Mélenchon. So maybe that allows the vote for Marine Le Pen to increase, but not enough to create a real dynamic.
Yes, but no, the fact that they be angry doesn't mean that they are silly. For example, when I went out from here, by the way, I was on France 24 yesterday night. I boarded a taxi cab whose driver was a French from Algerian origin. Believe me, I didn't push him. He told me, I will vote for Marine Le Pen. I don't like Mr. Macron because Mr. Macron is responsible for the unfair competition that by working, although I work 60, 70 hours per week, I have to repay the license, the taxi driver license that allows me to work, and I am facing now this unfair competition.
Well, it's the Uberization.
I don't want this deregulation. I don't want this, and there are people who have the feeling of a real continual impoverishment. I was very astonished about for example, the statement of Mr. Hollande, who said that if we get out from euro, it will be an increase in the prices. But did euro lower the price of the goods in Europe? He also said that there will be loss of jobs. But we lose half of our industrial potential in the past 20 years.
Are you trying to say that the social strategy or the social economic strategy of the Front National will actually get these working voters back on side? I think
there are still matches, and don't forget also that there is. Well, it's 5 points for a Euro-skeptic so-called petit candidat.
It's quite important, these points that Bruno Gollnisch is raising about the number of people who wants to leave the EU. I think one of the problems of Marine Le Pen's campaign, and probably one of the things she has to reflect upon in the next years, is that at the Cevipof we have a general inquiry about what we call the barometer of trust. So do you trust some institutions? And 85% of people that are replied to our studies say we're attached to the EU, and 85% don't want to leave the euro. So in a way, that's been blocking actually Marine Le Pen increasing the votes to have such a staunch affirmation against Europe and the EU. I think at one point it feeds her support, but at the same time it's also a glass ceiling for her.
Sure. Well, I
mean, in a way, you're right, but I think it's more.
I have the conclusion.
Bruno, yes. Just before we start, I'd like to actually get Frank, who has been very patiently waiting on the line now, and I know you're very busy, but thanks very much for your patience. Frank, you've heard the comments there coming from Vincent and Bruno. If you were a media strategist over the next 2 weeks working for either Macron or Le Pen, what would be your train of attack or your mode of attack?
Of course, it would be for Macron. Excuse me.
But what would be your key? What would be your killer app?
Just to make people understand that Macron means marche avant, and Marine Le Pen means marche arrière, backwards or forward. It's very simple. And all the program, and it was exactly the same with Mélenchon, because Mélenchon and Marine Le Pen are very close. The program are very close. They're against the system, and I'm sure that if Jean-Luc Mélenchon don't make a speech to say vote against Front National, of course there will be many voters from Mélenchon that will go to Marine Le Pen. So if I would be an advisor of Macron, is of course to increase the contrast, increase the biggest contrast, because it's not only choosing a president, it's choosing a destiny. And France now have the choice, and it's I love this choice because it's so contrast. It's Skywalker against Darth Vader once again, because it's really black and white. It's maybe the first time in the Fifth Republic that we have such a tremendous contrast between the two finalists. So I would continue to push the contrast, and because Marine Le Pen has to say exactly what is behind her program.
Okay, well, Franck Tapiro, thank you very much for joining us on the line today. We're coming actually quite to near the end of our program. We've only got a minute and a half left, but I want to just say quickly to both of you, if you could keep this within the time, and I want to give to both of you. We're looking now to legislative elections in June, but we still have, out of the 11 candidates, there was still quite a large show of force among these smaller candidates, including like Dupont-Aignan.
Yes.
So just is there, among these smaller candidates, is there a kingmaker among them? Vincent first.
No. I don't think so. I think it's going to be basically a fight between the four forces that have been leading this election: the National Front, the former Republicans, and En Marche, and a mix between France Insoumise and the Socialist Party. And to this view, I just want to say one word to say that comparing Mélenchon and Le Pen, for me, is quite a mistake. I understand that many people do this mistake because it looks some points in common, but they're not really the same.
Okay, Vincent Martigny, thank you very much for that comment. And Bruno, we've only got about 30 seconds left. So what would you have to say? Is there anyone among those candidates that you would wish to get into bed?
There is no, as you said, the kingmaker in the smaller candidates, but I think it's very important, for example, that Mr. Dupont-Aignan got 5 points, or even Mr. Asselineau 1 more point, being even more Eurosceptic than Marine Le Pen is. So logically, the people who supported them should vote for us.
Okay, well, thank you very much to Bruno Gollnisch, Franck Tapiro, and Vincent Martigny for joining me on the programme today.